The sky above the little town of Eldenwood was brushed with the soft hues of twilight, a wash of lavender and amber that seemed to linger longer than usual, as if the day itself was reluctant to leave. The air carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine, and the occasional murmur of a distant breeze rustled through the trees. It was that quiet hour when the world felt suspended, caught between the warmth of the sun and the cool embrace of the night. I was sitting on the porch of my grandmother's house, the old wooden planks creaking softly beneath my feet. In my hands, I held the pocket watch she had given me just a few days before she passed. It was an heirloom, she had said, something that had been in our family for generations. The watch was small and delicate, its brass casing worn smooth from years of use, and its face was marked with Roman numerals that seemed to hold secrets of their own. But there was something unusual about it. Every now and then, the watch would skip a beat. Not in the way a broken clock might stop or stutter, but in a way that felt deliberate, almost alive. It would tick-tock steadily for hours, and then, without warning, it would pause. Just for a moment, as if it were waiting for something. I had tried to understand it, to figure out what caused the pause, but there was no pattern, no explanation. It simply happened, and when it did, I felt a strange warmth in my chest, as though the watch were speaking to me in a language I couldn't quite grasp. Tonight, as I sat there with the watch in my palm, I wondered if it was trying to tell me something. The air around me felt heavier somehow, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to notice something I had missed. I ran my thumb over the watch's smooth surface, feeling the faint ridges of the engraving on the back. It was a word, but the letters were worn almost to nothing, and I could never quite make them out. The crickets began their evening song, their chirps weaving a soft melody that blended with the rustling of the trees. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sounds wash over me. When I opened them again, I noticed a light flickering in the woods beyond the house. It was faint, like the glow of a firefly, but it moved with purpose, darting between the trees as though it were leading me somewhere. I stood, the pocket watch still clutched in my hand, and took a step toward the edge of the porch. The light pulsed softly, as if inviting me to follow. I hesitated, glancing back at the house, but it felt quiet and empty, as though it, too, was holding its breath. I stepped off the porch and onto the path that led into the woods. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the moss and fallen leaves cushioning each step. The light ahead of me moved steadily, always just out of reach, but I felt no urgency to catch it. Instead, I moved slowly, letting the calm of the evening guide me. As I walked, I noticed that the world around me seemed to change. The air grew warmer, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the fading light into a soft, golden glow. The sound of the crickets faded, replaced by a gentle hum, like the distant echo of a song I had once known but couldn't quite remember. The light ahead paused, hovering in the air for a moment before settling on the ground. I stopped a few feet away, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the middle of the path, was a small wooden box. It was old, its surface weathered and cracked, but it seemed to radiate a quiet energy, as though it held something precious. I knelt down, the pocket watch still warm in my hand, and reached out to touch the box. As my fingers brushed against it, the watch skipped a beat. The pause was longer this time, stretching into a moment that felt endless. And then, just as the watch began to tick again, the box opened. Inside was a single key, its metal gleaming softly in the light. It was small, no bigger than my thumb, but it felt heavy with meaning. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, and noticed that it matched the engraving on the back of the watch. The letters were clearer now, though I still couldn't read them. I glanced up, but the light was gone, and the path ahead of me looked the same as it always had. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it all, if the key and the box and the light were just fragments of a dream. But the key was real, and so was the watch, and as I stood there in the quiet of the woods, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. Something had begun, and I wasn't sure where it would end. I turned and began to walk back toward the house, the key clasped in one hand and the watch in the other. The air around me seemed to hum with possibility, and for the first time in a long while, I felt as though I were exactly where I was meant to be. The night deepened, and the stars began to emerge, their light soft and steady. And the watch ticked on, its rhythm steady once more. For now, the house was quiet when I returned, the kind of quiet that feels like it's listening. I stepped inside, the key still warm in my hand, and closed the door softly behind me. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath my feet, a familiar sound that usually felt like home. Tonight, though, it felt different, as if the house knew something had changed. I walked to the living room, where the remnants of a fire glowed faintly in the hearth. My grandmother's rocking chair sat by the window, its cushions still indented from where she used to sit and watch the stars. I ran my fingers along the back of the chair, the fabric soft and worn. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice, humming that old lullaby she used to sing when I couldn't sleep. The pocket watch clicked quietly in my hand, its rhythm steady but insistent, as though it were trying to remind me of something. I looked down at the key again, turning it over in my palm. It was simple, unadorned, but there was something about it that felt ancient, like it had been waiting a long time to be found. I sat down on the edge of the couch, the watch and the key resting side by side on the coffee table. The firelight danced across their surfaces, casting flickering shadows that seemed to move in time with the watch's ticking. I felt a strange pull, a curiosity I couldn't quite name, as though the key and the watch were pieces of a riddle I was meant to solve. My grandmother had always been full of stories. She used to tell me how our family had lived in this house for generations, how each of us had a role to play in keeping its secrets safe. I had never asked her what those secrets were. It had always felt like one of those things I would understand when I was older. But now, sitting here with the watch and the key, I wondered if this was what she had meant. The watch skipped a beat, the pause longer this time, and I felt that familiar warmth in my chest. I picked it up, holding it close, and noticed something I hadn't seen before. Along the edge of the casing, there was a faint line, almost imperceptible, as though there was a small latch or hinge. I pressed my fingernail against it, and the watch clicked open. Inside, there was nothing but a tiny, circular indentation in the metal. It was the exact size of the key. I hesitated, my fingers trembling slightly as I picked up the key and placed it into the indentation. It fit perfectly, sliding into place with a soft click. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the watch began to hum, a low, steady vibration that I could feel in my bones. The room seemed to grow still, the air thick with anticipation. The firelight flickered, casting strange shapes on the walls, and the watch's ticking grew louder, echoing in the silence. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped. The watch clicked shut, and the key fell into my hand. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The watch felt heavier now, as though it were holding something more than time. I looked around the room, half expecting something to happen, but everything was just as it had been. And yet, I knew something had changed. I stood and walked to the bookshelf in the corner, the one that had always been filled with my grandmother's favorite stories. I ran my fingers along the spines, the leather and fabric smooth beneath my touch. Then, without knowing why, I pressed on the edge of the shelf. It swung open, revealing a hidden door. The air that came from behind it was cool and smelled of damp earth, like the inside of a cave. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped forward, the key and the watch clutched tightly in my hand. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of the watch in my hand, its steady ticking urging me forward. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the stairs, the wood creaking beneath my feet. The air grew colder as I descended, the darkness pressing in around me. But there was a soft glow at the bottom of the stairs, a light that seemed to pulse in time with the watch's ticking. I moved slowly, each step deliberate, until I reached the bottom. There, in the center of a small, circular room, stood a door. It was old, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change in the flickering light. The keyhole was just the right size for the key in my hand. I hesitated again, my fingers trembling as I raised the key to the lock. The watch skipped a beat, the pause longer this time, and I felt that warmth in my chest again, as though it were trying to tell me something. I turned the key. The doors swung open, revealing a room filled with light. It wasn't the harsh, bright light of the sun, but a soft, golden glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with objects I couldn't quite make out, but there was something comforting about the way they looked, as though they had been placed there with care. In the center of the room was a table, its surface smooth and polished. On it lay a single piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. I walked over to it, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, and picked it up. Written in my grandmother's handwriting were the words, "Trust the watch, and it will guide you." I looked down at the pocket watch in my hand, its face glowing softly in the light. The ticking was steady now, but there was something different about it, as though it were beating in time with my heart. I took a deep breath and stepped back, the weight of the room settling around me like a warm blanket. The door closed softly behind me, and the watch ticked on. For now, the room held its breath. Or maybe it was me. The air was still, the golden light wrapping around me like a quiet embrace. I stood there, the pocket watch in one hand and my grandmother's note in the other, feeling both small and immense, as though the room had swallowed me whole and yet expanded to fit the shape of my thoughts. The shelves around me were filled with things I didn't recognize, objects that seemed to hum with a kind of forgotten energy. There was a delicate teacup, its porcelain cracked but still beautiful. A pair of spectacles with lenses so thick they distorted the light. A spool of thread, its color a shade of blue that reminded me of the ocean at dusk. Each item felt like a piece of a story, but I couldn't quite put the words together. I stepped closer to the table, running my fingers along its smooth surface. The note had been written in my grandmother's hand, but it felt like more than just a message. It felt like a promise. Trust the watch, and it will guide you. I looked down at the pocket watch, its face glowing faintly in the golden light. The ticking was steady, but there was a softness to it now, as though it were trying to match the rhythm of my heartbeat. I pressed it to my chest, closing my eyes for a moment, and felt that warmth again, the one that seemed to seep into my bones whenever the watch paused. When I opened my eyes, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the far wall, there was a small, circular mirror. It was old, its frame tarnished and worn, but the glass was clear. I walked over to it, my footsteps echoing softly in the stillness, and looked at my reflection. I looked the same as I always did, my hair a little messy, my eyes a little tired, but there was something different about the way I saw myself. It wasn't just my face staring back at me. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. The watch skipped a beat, and the mirror's surface rippled like water. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat, but the ripple faded as quickly as it had come. When I looked again, my reflection was gone. In its place was an image of my grandmother. She was sitting in her rocking chair by the window, humming that old lullaby she used to sing. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were closed, but she looked peaceful, as though she were somewhere far away. "Grandma," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't respond, but the image shifted, and suddenly I was looking at a younger version of her. She was sitting at a table, the pocket watch in front of her, its face glowing just as it was now. She was writing something, her hand moving quickly across the page, and I realized it was the same note I had found on the table. The image rippled again, and she was gone. My reflection returned, but it felt different now, as though I were seeing myself through her eyes. I stepped away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The watch ticked on, its rhythm steady, but I could feel the warmth in my chest growing stronger, as though it were trying to tell me something. I turned back to the shelves, my eyes scanning the objects that lined them. They no longer felt like strangers. They felt like memories, like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting for me to put them together. I reached for the teacup, running my fingers along its cracked surface. As I touched it, a faint image flickered in my mind. A rainy afternoon, the sound of laughter, the taste of rose-scented tea. It was a memory, but it wasn't mine. I set the teacup down and reached for the spool of thread. This time, the image was clearer. A young girl sewing buttons onto a dress, her hands steady, her focus absolute. The thread was the same shade of blue, and I could feel the warmth of her determination, her pride. One by one, I touched the objects on the shelves, each one revealing a fragment of a story. Some were happy, some were sad, but all of them felt familiar, as though they had been waiting for me to find them. When I reached the end of the shelf, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small wooden box, its surface carved with the same intricate patterns as the door. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my hands, and noticed that it matched the engraving on the back of the watch. The watch skipped a beat, and the box opened. Inside was a single feather, its color a soft, iridescent blue. It shimmered in the golden light, and as I held it, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was important. I closed the box and set it back on the shelf, the feather still clutched in my hand. The room seemed to hum with approval, the golden light growing brighter for a moment before fading back to its usual soft glow. I sat down on the floor, the feather resting on my palm, and looked around the room. It no longer felt like a place of secrets. It felt like a place of belonging. The pocket watch ticked on, its rhythm steady, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. For now, that was enough. The feather felt impossibly light in my hand, as if it were made of air and memory rather than quill and down. Its iridescence shimmered softly, catching the golden light of the room and casting faint, spectral hues onto the walls. I held it carefully, my fingertips barely grazing its surface, as though it might dissolve if I pressed too hard. For a long while, I simply sat there on the floor, the feather resting in my palm, and let the stillness of the room settle around me. The pocket watch ticked steadily on the shelf beside me, its rhythm a soft, reassuring presence. The air was warm, carrying a faint scent of cedar and something else, something sweet and nostalgic, like the scent of my grandmother's perfume. I thought about the note she had left for me. Trust the watch, and it will guide you. It wasn't a demand or a riddle, it was an invitation. An offer to let go, to trust that things would unfold as they were meant to. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I had been holding on, how tightly I had been gripping the edges of my life, as though I could keep everything from slipping away if I just held on hard enough. But here, in this room, I felt my hands begin to loosen. I looked around at the shelves, their contents now familiar in a way I couldn't explain. The teacup, the spool of thread, the threadbare quilt folded neatly in one corner, they weren't just objects. They were fragments of lives, pieces of people who had lived and loved and lost and found their way again. And somehow, they were pieces of me, too. The feather twitched in my hand, a soft movement that made me catch my breath. I lifted it closer to my face, watching as its delicate edges seemed to ripple, though there was no breeze in the room. And then, very faintly, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't a sound, exactly, more like a feeling, a vibration that resonated in my chest rather than my ears. It was gentle, almost hesitant, as though it were testing the ear to see if I could hear it. I closed my eyes and focused on the feeling, letting it grow stronger. At first, it was just a hum, a soft murmur that hovered at the edge of my awareness. But slowly, it began to take shape, forming words I couldn't quite grasp but could feel deeply. Remember. The word lingered in the stillness, its weight settling over me like a blanket. I opened my eyes and looked at the feather, its iridescence pulsing softly in the golden light. Remember what? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The feather didn't answer, but I felt the whisper grow stronger, wrapping around me like a thread. I closed my eyes again, letting myself sink into the sensation. And then, gently, the memories began to come. They weren't my memories, not exactly. They were glimpses of things I had never seen but somehow knew. A woman sitting by a window, her hands smoothing the fabric of a dress. A man laughing as he carved a wooden toy for a child. A child running through a field, the sun warm on their face as they chased a butterfly. Each memory was brief, just a flicker, but they felt real, as though I were catching fragments of a life that had been lived long before me. And with each one, I felt a connection, a sense of belonging that I couldn't quite explain. The memories shifted, and suddenly I saw my grandmother. She was younger, her hair still dark, her hands busy as she poured tea into the cracked teacup that now sat on the shelf. She was smiling, her eyes bright with a kind of quiet joy that I remembered so well. And then I saw her as I had known her, sitting in her rocking chair by the window, humming that old lullaby. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were closed, but I could feel the warmth of her presence, the way it had always filled the room. "Grandma," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. The whisper in my chest grew softer, almost tender, as though it were holding me close. Remember. The word lingered in the air, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a sudden revelation or a dramatic change, just a quiet understanding, a gentle letting go. I sat there for a long time, the feather resting in my hand, the pocket watch ticking softly beside me. The room felt peaceful, as though it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to find my way here. Eventually, I stood and walked to one of the shelves, where I found a small glass jar. I placed the feather inside, its iridescence glowing softly through the glass, and set it back on the shelf. The feather seemed to pulse once, as though in gratitude, and the golden light in the room grew brighter for a moment before fading back to its usual soft glow. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. On the edge of the table, where my grandmother's note had been, there was now a small, folded piece of paper. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly, and opened it. Written in the same familiar handwriting were the words, "The watch is not just a keeper of time. It is a keeper of stories. And now, you are part of them." I folded the note and placed it carefully in my pocket, the weight of it settling against my chest. The room seemed to sigh, the golden light growing dimmer as I stepped toward the door. I glanced back once, my hand resting on the doorframe, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. The pocket watch ticked softly in my hand, its rhythm steady, and I felt that warmth in my chest again, soft and sure. For now, that was enough. The air outside was cool, the kind of cool that settles after the sun has dipped below the horizon but before the night fully takes hold. I stood on the porch, the pocket watch in my hand, its ticking a steady rhythm against the quiet of the evening. The stars were beginning to emerge, their light faint but constant, as though they had been waiting for this moment as much as I had. I looked down at the watch, its face glowing softly in the fading light. It felt different now, not in the way it looked or worked, but in the way it felt in my hand. It no longer felt like a relic or a puzzle to be solved. It felt like a companion, a quiet reminder of something I had always known but had forgotten how to feel. The house behind me was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. It was the kind that felt full of stories, full of memories, full of the soft hum of lives that had been lived and loved within its walls. I stepped off the porch and onto the path that led into the woods. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the moss and fallen leaves cushioning each step. The air smelled of earth and pine, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me that I wasn't alone, that the world was alive even in its stillness. I walked slowly, not because I was unsure of where I was going, but because I wanted to savor the moment. The watch ticked softly in my hand, its rhythm steady but gentle, as though it were matching the pace of my footsteps. The woods were different at night, quieter but no less alive. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the starlight into a soft, silver glow. The air was cooler here, but it wasn't cold. It felt like a blanket, wrapping around me and holding me close. I followed the path, the same path I had walked that first night when I had found the key. It felt familiar now, as though it were a part of me. The watch skipped a beat, the pause longer this time, and I felt that familiar warmth in my chest. I stopped and looked around, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the middle of the path, was the light again. It was faint, like the glow of a firefly, but it moved with purpose, darting between the trees as though it were leading me somewhere. I followed it, my steps steady but slow. The light pulsed softly, its glow warm and inviting, and I felt no urgency to catch it. Instead, I moved with it, letting it guide me. The woods seemed to change as I walked, the air growing warmer and the trees leaning closer, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the starlight into a soft, golden glow. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves faded, replaced by a gentle hum, like the distant echo of a song I had once known but couldn't quite remember. The light paused, hovering in the air for a moment before settling on the ground. I stopped a few feet away, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the middle of the path, was the small wooden box I had found that first night. It was old, its surface weathered and cracked, but it seemed to radiate a quiet energy, as though it held something precious. I knelt down, the pocket watch still warm in my hand, and reached out to touch the box. As my fingers brushed against it, the watch skipped a beat. The pause was longer this time, stretching into a moment that felt endless. And then, just as the watch began to tick again, the box opened. Inside was a single feather, its color a soft, iridescent blue. It shimmered in the light, and as I held it, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew it was important. I placed the feather in the box and closed it, the wooden surface smooth beneath my fingers. The light pulsed softly, as though in gratitude, and then it was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet of the woods. I stood and looked around, the pocket watch ticking softly in my hand. The air was warm, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the starlight into a soft, silver glow. The path ahead of me looked the same as it always had, but it felt different now, as though it were a part of me. I took a deep breath and began to walk back toward the house, the pocket watch ticking softly in my hand. The air around me seemed to hum with possibility, and for the first time in a long while, I felt as though I were exactly where I was meant to be. When I reached the porch, I sat down on the old wooden steps, the watch still clutched in my hand. The stars above were bright now, their light soft and steady, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. I looked down at the watch, its face glowing softly in the starlight. It no longer felt like a mystery or a key to something hidden. It felt like a reminder, a reminder that time was not just something to be measured, but something to be lived. The watch skipped a beat, the pause longer this time, and I felt that familiar warmth in my chest. I closed my eyes and let the stillness of the night settle around me. For now, that was enough. And it always would be. The watch ticked on, its rhythm steady, and the night held its breath. For now.